But Christianity is about trying to understand what our world means, what we mean. It's about a different level of engagement. So for me, there is no difficulty in a scientist being a Christian or a Christian being a scientist, because they are in effect thinking of this in quite different ways. So if I were to give a very simple analogy, I mean, here is a set of spectacles, which I think you can see. What I would say is that science is one of these spectacles, Christianity is the other. And when you look at the world through both a scientific and a Christian lens, you get a stereoscopic vision, which gives you depth. You're able to engage questions of how does our world function, very important, but also what's it all about? Why is life important? What is the meaning of life? So for me, a dialogue between science and religion is helpful, legitimate, and actually in my own case, personally very significant.
Hello, friends. This is Reason Plus Faith podcast, and today we will discuss some fascinating topics: science, faith, theology. What is connection between them? And today we will talk about it with one of the most authoritative theologian in the world, and he has written more books that most of us have read, and generations of students, including me, have grown up on his books. And his list of achievements is impressive. This is Alister McGrath, and this is theologian, apologist, priest, scientist, and public intellectual. And he's written so many books, including many of his books was translated in Ukrainian and Russian. And so hopefully this discussion will be helpful for our listeners. Professor McGrath, thank you so much for your time. It's a pleasure and honor to speak with you.
Well, I'm delighted to be with you. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much. In Ukrainian and Russian context, it's not so many theologian or philosophers from West or English world is famous or known, because we have huge gap because of USSR atheistic regimes, and also because we have language barrier. But you're the one of theologian who very famous, and many people read your books, so it's delightful to speak with you. And tell us little bit about yourself. How did you become a Christian, and why did you decide to become a scholar?
Well, when I was a teenager, back in the 1960s, I loved science. That was what I wanted to do when I grew up. But at the same time, I became very heavily involved in Marxism, which was very influential in the West during the late 1960s, early 1970s. I found myself really beginning to see everything through a Marxist lens. In other words, that religion was simply the opium of the masses, that there was no place for it in the modern world, that in effect, once the social condition of humanity had been rectified, then religion would just disappear. And I went up to Oxford University to study the natural sciences. And then while I was at Oxford, I encountered some very sympathetic and intellectually exciting accounts of Christianity. And I began to realize that I had misjudged Christianity and converted Christianity in my first year at Oxford University. And so in many ways, that pointed me in a completely new direction. And as I began to study Christianity in more detail, I formed this vision of wanting to study theology because I felt I wanted to understand my new faith better. And so I began to think in terms of continuing with my science, but eventually at some point in the future, switching to the study of theology. And that's what happened, really. Most of my academic life has been spent at Oxford University, and I'm still there. But certainly, I'm a Christian who knows a lot about Marxism, who knows a lot about atheism, and who is very, very concerned to be able to engage with a secular culture and explain why Christianity is so relevant, so exciting, and why it can make a difference to so many people.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and Marxism is one of the main ideology in post-Soviet countries, so we are very well aware about this danger of these ideas. And many of your books is deal with the relationship between science and faith or religion in general. So how would you describe this relationship? Do you have some model which we should follow, or do you follow?
Yes, I have a model I follow. Again, when I was an atheist, back in the late 1960s, early 1970s, the dominant model was what we call the conflict or the warfare narrative, which is saying, in effect, science and religion are permanently and necessarily in conflict. There is no possibility of any dialogue between them. And of course, that was very prominent in Soviet anti-religious propaganda, particularly during the 1960s. But I think now I would not agree with that at all. Let me tell you what I think the right approach is. Science and Christianity are very important in their own right, and each of them illuminates part of reality. If you like, they are both they're both there on a spectrum of knowledge. They both have their own distinct topics of engagement, but they don't contradict each other because they're asking different questions. So for me, science is about helping us to understand how our world functions. And that's a very important point. But Christianity is about trying to understand what our world means, what we mean. It's about a different level of engagement. So for me, there is no difficulty in a scientist being a Christian or a Christian being a scientist, because they are in effect thinking of this in quite different ways. So if I were to give a very simple analogy, I mean, here is a set of spectacles, which I think you can see. What I would say is that science is one of these spectacles, Christianity is the other. And when you look at the world through both a scientific and a Christian lens, you get a stereoscopic vision, which gives you depth. You're able to engage questions of how does our world function? Very important. But also, what's it all about? Why is life important? What is the meaning of life? So for me, a dialogue between science and religion is helpful, legitimate, and actually, in my own case, personally very significant.
Okay, thank you. But I guess you don't agree with idea of Stephen Jay Gould about this NOMA, that there is no connection between them. So you see this as a intersection between these two fields.
Yeah, Stephen Jay Gould, for most of his life, held that science and religion were separate. They couldn't talk to each other, so you kept them in separate compartments. Interestingly, in the final 2 years of his life, he changed his mind. He said they have to talk to each other because our world is so complex that we really need that dialogue. So I think Gould, in effect, towards the end of his life, really did change his mind. But certainly, I would say that an attempt to simply keep science and religion in isolated, watertight compartments is pointless and actually impossible. And really, what I would say is that the best option is to bring these together in a creative synthesis, realizing that neither of them is adequate on their own, but put them together and you have a much deeper and richer vision of life.
Wow, interesting. I didn't know about this. And perhaps most famous atheist, Richard Dawkins, he is entirely against this approach. And your book that criticize his ideas, his God from the selfish gene to the God delusion, has been published in Russian. So in my estimation, at least 10 your books was published in Russian. So it's a really impressive list. And let's talk about this phenomenon of the new atheism, which you are very familiar. Why have these Dawkins-style arguments has been so popular, and what is the future of the new atheism?
I think that's a very good question. Why has the new atheism been so popular? My answer is this: because it is so simplistic. It says, in effect, the question is really easy. Religion is evil, science is good. Religion is socially backward, science is progressive. And science, of course, is about being right, whereas religion is just about asserting things which you can't prove to be true. I think a lot of people liked that idea back in the first decade of the 21st century when the movement was getting underway. I think now there's been a much more critical evaluation of this. Most of my friends who were involved in New Atheism have walked away from it because they feel it is simplistic, it distorts a complex debate, and also it is existentially unsatisfying. New Atheism just couldn't deal with questions. So let me try and outline what I think are some of the main concerns here. The first concern was that Dawkins used criteria to judge religious beliefs that he did not apply to his own beliefs. In other words, Dawkins would say to Christians, prove that your beliefs are right scientifically. But he failed to ask the question, can I prove my own atheism? And of course, you cannot. Indeed, when I was an atheist myself, one of the things that really concerned me was I knew I could not prove that there was no God. It was a matter of faith. And I think that that's a big problem for the new atheism, because in effect it was saying we must use these criteria in judging religious people, but we don't use them to judge our own positions. Secondly, Dawkins basically knows nothing about religious belief at all. He's criticizing something he's invented. It's not a serious dialogue between real representatives of Christianity and Dawkins. It's in effect Dawkins critiquing a complete caricature, a misrepresentation of what Christianity is. And many people now would recognize that. What has happened to New Atheism is it has simply fallen apart. It's fallen apart for two reasons, which I'll talk about. Number one, that the movement itself fragmented. And number two was that there was a growing realization of the inadequacy of Dawkins' arguments. On the first front, basically, many writers have now left the New Atheism because they consider it to be very white, middle class, Western, and male. In other words, it occupies a very distinct sociological niche. And more than that, in effect, the movement seemed to end up being very, very critical of women of all people. Think of it again, all the leading New Atheists were men. And also, it ended up that the movement factionalized. It broke down to different compartments. But the main reason is that people just became disillusioned with the New Atheism. They said it promoted a false, superficial certainty, which just could not be sustained on the basis of the evidence available. And recently, I, with a colleague called Dennis Alexander at Cambridge University, put together a collection of essays called Coming to Faith Through Dawkins. And it's very interesting. It's a collection of 12 reflections by individuals who began by thinking, Richard Dawkins is wonderful. He's answered all of our questions. The New Atheism is, wonderful. And then began to realize it wasn't that simple. And we have 12 narratives of disillusionment and then rethinking. And in many cases, these people rediscovered Christianity. So I think the New Atheism really is in decline. At Oxford today, very often when I talk about the New Atheism, I have to explain to people who Richard Dawkins is, because many younger people do not know who Richard Dawkins is. I think that shows you how much things have changed since the beginning of the century.
Yeah, absolutely. And I should say that God delusion was never so popular in our countries. My guess is because Dawkins' idea that religion is never, that atheism is never promote violence is completely false in our context when we see so many violence because of atheistic regimes. So yeah, and that's interesting. And my own journey also began with reading God Delusion, one from one side, and also books from Christian apologists like you about science and faith connection. And I saw this so simplistic picture that led me also to embrace Christianity. So that's interesting. And what is your approach for dialogue with atheists? Some of your books deal with so-called narrative apologetics. So do you think this is the best approach to dialogue discussion?
What I found is that many atheists are nervous about having serious conversations about this topic. And I think it's because they realize that their position is vulnerable, that they are worried that they'll be shown to have a very inadequate worldview. I think that the collapse of the New Atheism has actually been very significant because it has removed this cultural belief in the West that atheism is intellectually superior to religion. That's no longer really the case at all. So I think it's very interesting. My own approach is this. I believe in talking to people who I don't agree with. And I believe in saying, look, let me tell you what I think. I want to know what you think. And as we begin our conversations, I'll very often say, well, I'm really interested to hear you say that because I would have very serious difficulties. Let me give you one problem I would have. Now, show me I'm wrong, and very often when I simply make a point like, can you prove there is no God? They get very, very defensive. I think the reason is they know they can't. And I think that very often I'm able to have a very productive conversation in which I end up by persuading them that atheism is a belief, a belief. And I'm just publishing a new book. In fact, it came out just a few days ago, which is very much about this whole question of how important beliefs are. That very often, when you look at things that people very often say are just obviously right, for example, atheism, it turns out, in fact, to be a belief. And that, I think, is a really important point to make. I would also want to say that conversations are really very important. You may not, in effect, convert your dialogue partner, but very often you'll find that you plant seeds of doubt in their mind about whether their own position is quite as straightforward or as robust or as secure as they'd originally thought. And very often that catalyzes a whole new way of thinking, which can be very, very helpful in the longer term.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that there is a place for Thomas Aquinas-style arguments, or do you think that this whole approach is too complicated for most people?
I think that the approaches that Thomas Aquinas developed are actually very helpful, but they do require quite a long time to set out and explain. And I think that I will very often say Thomas Aquinas is very helpful in in showing the basic rationality of faith. But unfortunately, certainly in Western culture, we have limited attention span on the part of our audiences, which means very often we just don't have the time to develop these arguments in any depth. But they are good, they are very persuasive. The difficulty is that people nowadays want arguments that are really sound bites, very short, and it's difficult to reduce Aquinas to sound bites.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So you're also a historian of Christianity, and you have written books on the Reformation, particularly on biography on John Calvin, that we also have in Russian. So how important is knowledge of history to theological conclusions? And how would you advise approaching the combination of history and theology?
I think history is very, very important because whatever historical period we are looking at, we have to appreciate that they thought this was the way things actually are. And as we look back on that period, we say that's the way they thought it was back then. And the first lesson you learn from history is that what seems to us to be self-evident today is simply what this period in history thinks. And in a generation's time, they'll think differently. So that's one of the very important points to make against the new atheism, which is very, very weak on history, by the way. That actually we have to realize that very often intellectual fashions rise and fall. The new atheism is one of these. But for me, studying history is very, very important if you're a theologian or indeed if you're a Christian, simply because they give you access to riches from the past, people like Luther or Calvin, or we can give many, many more examples, who actually have very important things to say which do enrich us. And so I find the study of history very helpful in that it gives me access to leading thinkers from the past who can help me develop my own ideas today.
Yeah, absolutely. And just yesterday, I read one article that claims that this whole idea about essentialism approach to religion and science it's false because science and religion is always have historical context that formed these ideas in that time. So we should always see or give account to this historical context to understanding of these topics. Yeah, and C.S. Lewis, Alive, your massive biographies, which I really enjoyed. Brilliant biography of C.S. Lewis, which published on 50th anniversary of his death. And tell us a little bit about why you decided to write another biography of him.
Well, C.S. Lewis has been very important for me personally. As I was saying earlier, I converted from atheism to Christianity, and As I was developing my thinking at Oxford, as a Christian, I found myself asking questions which my Christian friends weren't really able to answer very well. And eventually, some of them said to me, look, Alistair, you really do need to look at C.S. Lewis. So I didn't really know very much about C.S. Lewis, but I went into a bookstore in Oxford in 1974 and bought my first ever book by C.S. Lewis. And it was called They Asked for a Paper. I began to read it, and I suddenly realized this man is answering the questions I'm asking. And so, if you like, Lewis has been my intellectual and spiritual traveling companion since 1974. That's a very long time. And I continue to read him, I continue to enjoy him. And I also continue to commend to people to say, look, Lewis actually really is very helpful. I want to explain to you why this is, what you will find in him, how it can be very useful to you. And this is just who I am, that Lewis is very, very important. I want to write that biography partly because it was an act of intellectual homage to him, but more than that, I wanted people to be able to gain an insight into this fascinating figure that might help them make more sense of his writings. And so the biography is both a study of Lewis as a person, but also, if you like, an introduction to the books he wrote. So I hope it will be useful in equipping a new generation to come to terms with Lewis.
Yeah, absolutely. So how would you describe Lewis? Because I hear some voices that say, for example, that he's not a good philosopher, but he's more like a good storyteller, something like this, or he's not a good theologian, but he's a good lay person. So how would you describe? Do you think that he's very important also for academic theologian and philosophers, or just to lay people?
I think he is very important to lay people because he speaks to them in a very accessible way, and he asks questions which are very relevant to ordinary Christians. So I think Lewis has a very wide reach, but I think on the academic side, he's more important than you might think. Although we remember Lewis as an apologist and, of course, as a literary scholar, it's very important to remember that his initial teaching appointments at Oxford were in philosophy. So Lewis was a professional philosopher. He ended up moving from philosophy into English literature, but he always maintained this philosophical outlook. So it's certainly true that many professional philosophers don't really rate Lewis very highly. I accept that. But nevertheless, Lewis had a philosophical way of thinking, which I think shows at many points, for example, in his critique of naturalism, or indeed in some of his ways of developing apologetic arguments, where he clearly thinks philosophically. Also, I mean, many would say Lewis isn't really a very good theologian. And in one sense, that's true, because Lewis is not an academic theologian, but he did read many, many Christian writers, particularly from the early Christian period, the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. And I think that when the University of St Andrews here in Great Britain awarded Lewis a doctorate of divinity in 1947, I think it was, they said, we are giving you this degree because we think you are developing a new approach to theology which relies on the imagination and stories. Now, I think that's very significant because this was an honorary degree given to Lewis by a very significant British university, St Andrews, which in effect was saying, as theologians, we can see you are developing a new approach to theology, which we think needs to be taken very seriously, and it's going to be productive. And I think that's a very wise insight, and I think the passing of time has completely validated their judgment.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that there are some dangerous ideas in Lewis theology or philosophy? Because
I think that
yeah,
I think as you read Lewis, you'll always find things you disagree with, or things that you don't feel he's quite got right. I mean, to give an example, I mean, as I read Lewis, I don't think he quotes the Bible enough. I think that he does quote the Bible sometimes, but he does not give you the impression of somebody who has immersed himself in the study of Scripture. But nevertheless, he does some very good things with the Bible, so I can't complain too much. But I think one of my concerns would be that there are points at which Lewis is trapped in his historical context. And I think that's particularly clear, for example, in his Chronicles of Narnia, which in many ways are embedded in Britain in the 1940s. And the result is that sometimes it's difficult for people today to read the Chronicles of Narnia, and they find it difficult to understand the social conventions that lie behind the narrative. And of course, if you're outside the United Kingdom, it's even more difficult. So there are points where I think Lewis needs to be rethought, but that is true of any historical figure. So I don't want to criticize Lewis too much on this, because there is so much there that's helpful and valuable that it seems rather niggling, rather fastidious to critique him for these things. I think that everyone finds in Lewis things that they like and things they find helpful, and certainly there'll be some things that they won't like. What I would say to you is, if you find something in Lewis you feel uneasy about, leave it and maybe come back to it later, because you may find that as you read and think more, you begin to see what he's getting at, but it may take a while.
Yeah, that's certainly true about me and my reading of Lewis. Yeah, great insight. And there is some stories which is very popular, that some time ago in Lewis' life, there was a woman, is Elizabeth Enscombe, philosopher, who completely crushed his philosophical argument. And after that, Lewis started writing this Chronicle of Narnia and other fairy tales. So what do you think about this story? How fair it is?
It's not very fair, I'm afraid. One of my best friends at Oxford, who was a don in philosophy, was present at that debate, and told me all about it. He's dead now, unfortunately, but what he said was Elizabeth Anscombe was able to really defeat Lewis in that argument because she used Wittgenstein's arguments against him, and Lewis hadn't read Wittgenstein, so really struggled to answer her because she was speaking a language and using an approach that Lewis simply did not know. My friend's view as a professional philosopher was that what Lewis had presented was perfectly acceptable. It needed tweaking, it needed refinement of points, but actually the basic argument was fine. So I think that we find writers like various writers making the point that Lewis was defeated by Anscombe, so he gave up rational argument and wrote stories instead. Now, I have to say, I don't find that plausible at all. Lewis was writing stories long before that engagement with Anscombe, and his increasing interest in fiction has nothing to do with having problems with argumentation. It's more his growing realization that the literary mode of narrative is enormously helpful at an apologetic level. So A.N. Wilson, for example, in his biography of Lewis, does take this approach. Lewis was beaten by a philosopher, so he stopped doing philosophy and wrote stories instead. It's not really a very reliable assessment of the situation.
Yeah. And perhaps an important contribution to Lewis' research has been your clarification on the date of his conversion to Christianity. And could you tell us how you discovered the error in Lewis' memoirs?
Well, I suggest that Lewis's conversion to believing in God may have taken place a year later than people thought, and I noticed this in preparing my biography for Lewis. I read everything Lewis wrote in chronological order, and so I was reading his letters of 1927 and 1928. And Lewis himself says, it all happened in 1927. As I read Lewis's letters, I saw no change happening in 1927 at all. In early 1928, he writes to his friend Owen Barfield saying, you better come and see me very, very quickly, because if you don't, I'm going to end up going into a monastery because God is pressing in on me. Now, that's the language that Lewis uses in Surprised by Joy to describe his experiences immediately before his conversion. But this letter dates from the spring of 1928. So it just struck me that this wasn't quite right. Then also, Lewis makes it very clear that when he converted, when he began to believe in God again, he did two things. He began to go to church. he began to go to his college chapel. There are no documents answering the question, when did Lewis begin to go to church? But there is a letter Lewis wrote in October 1928 saying, I am now going to college chapel. It means I have to get up early in the mornings. And he's saying this is something new. So again, that points to a year later. And the other point is actually Lewis is terribly bad at remembering dates. I am too, so I can't complain. But I think that my conclusion is that this is not a significant discovery. Lewis got a date wrong. Lewis got lots of dates wrong. Surprised by Joy is full of dating errors, but then they're not significant in setting out his journey of discovery. And so for me, the important thing is that Lewis really came to believe in God, really came to be a Christian. And the dating of that, it's not actually hugely important, but the really important thing is it happened.
Yeah, absolutely. And how could you describe his conversion? So it was like from atheism to deism to theism and Christianity, or from atheism to Christianity directly? How it happened?
I think it's helpful to say there were two main stages. The first is the movement from atheism to believing in God. That's a very important transition, but it's only part of the journey. Because the second part of the journey is from just believing in a generic God to believing in Christianity. And that meant that Lewis had to try and work out how Jesus Christ fitted into his way of thinking. And he struggled to quite see how somebody who lived 2,000 years ago could continue to be relevant today. Then he and Tolkien had that very long conversation in Magdalen College Gardens in September 1931 about the role of stories, the role of myth. And Tolkien tried to explain to Lewis that in effect Christianity told a story, and the story is about Christ. And that once you see that, everything begins to look different. And Lewis, after that conversation, wrote a very long letter to his best friend, Arthur Greaves, describing exactly what happened and saying, I have now passed over to believing in Christianity. And the basic ideas that Tolkien explained to Lewis in that very long walk become critically important for Lewis from that point onwards. The idea Christianity tells a story, that you and I are part of that story, that one of the best ways of explaining and commending Christianity is to retell its story. And if you like, Tolkien played a really important part in helping Lewis come to belief in Christianity, not simply belief in God.
Interesting. I remember one his quote when he said that he actually find very plausible idealism. So this idea that of Bradley and other philosophers that there is only world of ideas. So what do you think after his conversion to Christianity? Is it he still believe in this idealism approach to world?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, you're quite right that Lewis was very influenced by idealism, particularly actually the local version at Oxford called Oxford Realism, which flourished in the 1920s. My own impression is that although Lewis was very sympathetic to idealism, it played less and less role in his thinking from, I think, the late 1930s onwards. I don't really see Lewis doing anything with the idealist philosophies that he liked so much as a younger man. But I think it's significant to see that maybe Lewis considered Christianity to be the fulfillment of a good idealism. But he doesn't really engage with the questions that most idealist philosophers would consider to be important.
Interesting. Thank you so much. So many questions about Lewis because I really like Lewis and his approach. And your next book is Christianity's Dangerous Ideas. This is a history of Protestantism. And in your opinion, can we define Protestantism? Can modern movement like, say, Pentecostals or Baptists call themselves Protestant?
Well, I think the origins of the word Protestant are due to historical contingency. It was a term used to refer to a group of people who protested against certain people being excluded from a meeting. So the word Protestant doesn't really tell you what the movement is for. It may tell you what it's against, but doesn't actually help you define it. And of course, it became clear quite quickly century, there were three main kinds of Protestantism: Lutheranism, Calvinism, the Radical Reformation, and then, of course, the English Reformation took its own distinct way of thinking after that. So it is a term that isn't really all that helpful, but it's widely used because it's a generic term, which means a form of Christianity that's not Catholicism and isn't Orthodoxy. But you rightly raise the question, does that mean, for example, that Pentecostalism is a form of Protestantism? Well, in one sense it does, because what I think gives Protestantism its identity really is a focus on the Bible and a rejection of the authority structures of Catholicism and Orthodoxy. So you might say then that Pentecostalism is a form of Protestantism. But the difficulty is that very often the word Protestantism is used in a broad sociological sense, simply to mean a Christian who isn't Catholic or Orthodox, and it doesn't really focus on theological ideas. So I think the word is widely used, but it's used often in a slightly imprecise way.
Yeah, absolutely. And when we're speaking about, for example, some neo-Christian movement or heretical movement like prosperity gospels and so on, so could we say that it isn't actually Protestant movement because it rejects authority of the Bible and some traditional ideas of Protestants, something like this?
I think that you could certainly say that. I would add that very often these movements originate within Protestantism because there's no real external control on them, and very often it involves a misreading of the Bible. So I think if I can put it like this, Protestants appeal to the authority of the Bible, but very often that's interpreted individually. This is the way I read the Bible. And the difficulty with that, of course, is that if you find people saying, well, as I read the Bible, I see it as being an endorsement of those who actively seek status and wealth. It's sometimes hard to argue with that. So my concern is that very often some of the more strange and radical ways of thinking originate within Protestantism because there's this emphasis on reading the Bible, but there isn't sufficient attention to what you get when you read the Bible. We need people to say, no, that's not a good reading for this reason.
Yeah, and that's interesting that reformers themselves, like Luther and Calvin, they also emphasize this very important role of tradition and church history. So it's not just reading the Bible at all. Yeah,
No, you're quite right. They do emphasize the importance of reading the Bible, but also the role of writers in the past like Augustine and Athanasius in effect saying this is the good way of reading the Bible. Because the difficulty is if you read the Bible any way you like, then I'm afraid you're going to end up getting lost. And Luther and Calvin were very much saying we are reading the Bible as we believe Augustine and Athanasius were reading the Bible as well.
yeah, absolutely. And so you have written so many books and you obviously read many books. So how do you conduct your research? Can you give some advice to young students how we should approach this?
Well, I think research really involves engaging questions you think are interesting and important. And so, as an apologist, for example, I do research other apologists. I learn a lot about how they understand their calling and their role and the approaches they use. And I'm always asking, can I learn from this? So, what I would say to people listening to me now is that the best form of research is always something that's going to help you think more clearly, something that's going to help you preach more effectively, or something that's going to help you communicate more effectively with our wider culture. So, you can research something which is of purely academic interest, and that might be interesting, I'm sure it would be. But the more you feel that what you are researching is important, really matters, the better your research is going to be, and it will help you grow in your faith and also discern what your own distinct form of ministry is going to be.
Yeah. So do you have some schedule? How do you read books? For example, how many pages per day, or it's purely on enthusiasm? So how do you think best approach to this?
I think the best approach is to be completely realistic and say, look, very often you can't say I'm going to do 6 hours reading a day of this because life is unpredictable and you may find that you just don't get that time. What I think you need to do is to find a way of being able to make the best possible use of relatively small amounts of time, like half an hour here, an hour there, and to try and remember where you are in your reading or thinking. Keep a notebook, write down thoughts you are having, and date them. So in effect, you can come back to them and find this. Because the difficulty is that, particularly if you're a busy pastor, you are going to find it difficult to be able to remember exactly what you had learned from reading a particular passage. You need to write it down and find your way back to it if you want to continue that line of thought. So I think each of us develops our own way of doing research, but the key thing is if you find something that's really interesting and helpful, make sure you don't lose that. Make sure you find a way of being able to go back to that and develop it further, and above all, remembering it.
Yeah, absolutely. And what books or resources would you recommend to begin journey to our listeners into Christian thought? Obviously, it's many of you great books that we have in Russian and Ukrainian language, but maybe you have your favorite authors and books that you could recommend.
I read so many books that it's quite difficult to know which ones to recommend. But here's a general point I would make. It's always helpful, I think, to have what I would call a traveling companion. That is to say, a writer who you get to understand and who you feel you keep reading new books perhaps, but also their older books. And you find that, in fact, these are really helpful. Try and find one like that. For me, it's C.S. Lewis. I think that's very clear. It might be something quite different for other people, and I fully understand that. But the important thing is to find someone who you really say, this person knows who I am. He speaks to me or she speaks to me. And one of the things you can do when you're talking to other people is ask them who they're reading at the moment and what they are getting out of that. Because very often that's how you discover the people who might well be your traveling companions. Ask your friends, who are you reading? What are you getting out of it? What's helpful about it? And just see if that helps you identify people you might look at in turn.
Interesting. Do you have any future projects for your next books or next ideas that you would develop?
Well, I've just finished a book on C.S. Lewis on science and religion, which I think brings together
Wow.
two of my main interests in life. And so at the moment, I'm now setting that to one side because that's done and thinking about what comes next. And I've decided I'm going to have a little break where I just think about what I might do. But there will be new projects, I promise.
Yeah, great. And maybe last question, as a historian and as an apologist, do you find uh, reasonable or useful to read so different authors, like for example Karl Barth, C.S. Lewis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer? They so different in their approach. So do you think it could be useful to find one approach and one author, or read them all and try to create coherent picture of all of these thoughts?
I think it's good to have a few writers who you really like and trust. Be very careful. You are not their slave. They are there to help you. Don't feel you have to defend them at every point. There may be points where you feel that's not right, but other points, oh, that's really good. So be selective as you read these people. But the other thing I would say is that actually read widely because you may find some wonderful quotations, some wonderful stories that might help you personally or might become part of your preaching or indeed that you might incorporate into books or articles you're writing. So it's very, very difficult to set out a universal method. The important thing is, read widely, talk to people, write down anything that looks good so you can find your way back to it. And the key thing is that the more wisdom you have at your disposal, the more you're going to help other people. Sometimes by saying, here's what I think, but sometimes by saying, actually, there's a really good discussion. This is C.S. Lewis. Let me tell you what he says and see if that helps you, because if it does, here's where you'll find that discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great pleasure to speak with you today because you're a great influence not only on me but our listeners, and I think that it would be very helpful discussion to our listeners. So thank you so much for your work, for your great ministry, and may God bless you. And I hope to see you next projects, next books, also in our languages in the future.
Thank you very much, and thank you for a very enjoyable conversation.